Disclaimer. No one expects J.K. Rowling. Actually, everyone does. Everyone expects J.K. Rowling. But I am not J.K. Rowling! Ha! Hermione labored under her self-imposed silence, with mixed results. She felt like she was fading into the background in the boisterous Weasley-Pruitt household, although she was so busy with her various projects that might have happened anyway. Old Muriel was just as outspoken as the rest of them. She'd been largely pacified by Hermione's gesture, but she also seemed to regard her silence as itself being somewhat uncouth. You just couldn't win with that woman. Oddly enough, Muriel did seem to like Crookshanks. Hermione's cat had an uncanny sense for danger, as he had darted through the flue between everyone's legs when his owner was too worried about not getting killed by Death Eaters to think about him. She'd been immensely relieved, and more than a little disturbed, when she put the pieces together, and she was worried she wouldn't be able to take care of him much longer if the war continued to heat up. But whatever else she was, Muriel seemed to be a refined cat lady, so perhaps Hermione could leave him with her. Fred and George came at once when they heard what had happened. They made a few obligatory jokes at Hermione's expense, but they recognized the gravity of the situation and went easy on her. They were devastated by the loss of their home, even though they'd moved most of their things out to their flat. When Molly and Arthur explained what happened, Hermione started to write out, "I'm so sorry." George grabbed her away from her cards and held her close to him. "Hermione, this isn't your fault," he said. "You were just being the brave one who actually said you-know-whose name. Everyone else was scared of it even without him doing this last time, but no one expected them to actually do something about it." Hermione suddenly started giggling silently. "All right, what's so funny?" George said when he felt the vibrations. Hermione scribbled out a message, and he read it out loud. "No one expects the Spanish Inquisition? Huh?" Hermione mimed laughing even harder at his delivery, even though it honestly wasn't a very good joke. George kissed her to shut her up. "Fred, do you know what's happening out there?" Molly asked. "Are we wanted wizards or anything?" "We haven't heard anything yet, but it hasn't been very long," said Fred. "I still think the Ministry will have to go on functioning normally," Arthur said. "I don't want you going out until we know it's safe, Arthur," Molly insisted. "Merlin, I don't know what we'll do if we have to go completely into hiding." "We can find out, Mum," Fred said. "Yeah, we'll get answers," George agreed. "Boys, you might not be safe out there either," she said. "No one came for us this morning, though," George told her. "That won't make much difference, George. Your family name will cause you enough trouble as it is, if you know who's taken over." Hermione rapped her fist on the table to get everyone's attention, and she handed out another card. "The Death Eaters will know they weren't at the Burrow this morning and weren't involved in that. They'll be better off than the rest of us. Just be careful. Or else." Fred and George walked down Diagon Alley cautiously, but openly. The street was nearly empty, with most witches and wizards staying in, fearful from the news of Scrimgeour's death and what might follow. But the official presence was unchanged. Aurors still patrolled the alley, and they were even the same Aurors. No one they knew or suspected of being a Death Eater. Of course, that didn't rule out the Imperius Curse, but it looked like they weren't changing their patrol patterns any. They also knew they wouldn't get much information from them. The rank and file either wouldn't know what was really going on at the top, or would be embarrassed. It would be almost impossible to find someone who could authoritatively say whether someone would be lying in wait at the Ministry to arrest their father, or if the Death Eaters were planning a raid on the joke shop. Luckily, Fred and George knew someone placed high enough to know, and, more importantly, they knew where he lived. Percy had just come up to his apartment and unlocked the door when he heard a pair of voices behind him. "Hello, brother." Before he knew it, Percy was tied to a chair and wandless in his own apartment, with George shining his wand in his face. "What in Merlin's name are you doing?" he demanded. "Just paying a friendly visit to our big brother," Fred answered. "Asking him to come to dinner at Aunt Muriel's," George answered. "And that's all we're doing, if you know what's good for you. And us." What is this all about, and why are you shining that light in my face? Percy demanded. I dunno, said George, pulling his wand light back. Hermione said this is something Muggles do. But seriously, Percy, we want you to come back, Fred said. Mum and Dad are worried. We're worried too, comes down to it. Percy sighed in his usual put-upon way. Look, I'm glad to hear you're all right. I was worried about you when I heard the burrow accidentally burnt down. Everyone is all right, right? Yes, but... accidentally? George said. Where did you hear that? That's what the Aurors said. The twins groaned. They would say that, they said in unison. I know it sounds suspicious, but that's the only official word I've heard. What happened? What happened? Fred exploded. Bloody Death Eaters! That's what happened! Percy flinched a little and spoke a bit shakily. Ah, so you two didn't blow it up, then? The twins snarled, but he went on. How did they get in, though? Dad's been so paranoid I figured the wards would be in top shape. Paranoid? You'd know if you actually came home, George snapped. Didn't you hear anything? You were there when the Ministry fell, weren't you? I'm afraid I know nothing about any supposed fall of the Ministry, Percy said in such a rehearsed and stilted way that, even coming from him, it was obvious. Fred and George's eyes narrowed. You know something, don't you? Said Fred. I'm sorry, I cannot confirm or deny classified Ministry information. Did you know about the taboo curse? Fred demanded. Percy's stilted tone vanished, replaced by genuine curiosity. What's a taboo curse? If you say you know whose name, he knows where you are, Fred answered, and it breaks through wards. Percy paled. That's how they got in? One of you tripped it? Hermione tripped it, growled George, to his further surprise. Hermione? You don't know anything, do you? Said Fred. Did you even know she was staying with us, that her parents were dead? She always said his name, so she's silenced herself so she won't slip up, her boyfriend said quietly. She's hating herself for tripping the curse right now, that her being brave backfired like that, and now we have to be the ones to put it all back in order. So all we want to know is what's going on at the Ministry. Percy rolled his eyes. I'm sorry, I cannot confirm or deny classified Ministry information. Don't be stupid, Fred said. We know half of it already. Thickness is imperious, the Death Eaters have infiltrated it top to bottom, and you know who is pulling the strings behind the scenes. You know who is no threat to the Ministry, he said in that same rehearsed tone. The Ministry is strong enough to stand up to all enemies. Ah, damn it! All we want to know is if the R's are going to be there to arrest Dad if he goes into work on Monday. Percy thought for just a moment, seeming to choose his words. I've been able to come and go as I please since Scrimgeour's death without any trouble, he said. The twins looked at each other. I didn't hear a no there, did you, brother? George said. No, I did not, brother. Because I know how to keep my head down, Percy growled. Pure-blood Ministry workers have nothing to fear so long as they are not openly working against the Ministry. Only purebloods? George said. That's what's relevant to this conversation. What about non-purebloods? He repeated, thinking of Hermione. That is not relevant to this conversation. And that got the message through, loud and clear. Thank you, Percy, George said after a minute. Don't mention it, Percy said. He meant it literally. Oh, but there is one thing. Yeah? I'm pretty sure they're planning on eliminating Dad's position. The twins' eyes widened. The Counterfeit Spell Office? Fred said. The Office for the Detection and Confiscation of... Yes, the Counterfeit Spell Office. And bump him back to the misuse of Muggle artifacts. Percy shook his head. I think they're going to bump him down to Obliviator. That was a bad sign, even if he wasn't going to be arrested. Their father had always been undervalued by the Ministry, in their opinion, and obliviators didn't get paid very well, not least because any idiot could obliviate a muggle. "All right, then," said Fred. "Are you coming home, Percy?" Percy lowered his gaze. "I'm sorry for the rift I've caused in our family, but it's probably best for everyone involved if I stay away. As the minister's personal assistant, I can't afford any serious entanglements." That message came through clear enough, too, but they didn't much like it. With people she couldn't meet face to face, Hermione exchanged letters through Dobby while she was in seclusion. She did send one letter full of nonsense to Harry by owl just for misdirection purposes. Ron and Ginny assured her that they didn't blame her for their house and their letters, and they said they were more worried about Harry's situation. He had to unlearn saying you-know-who's name more than anybody. Even though he was safe in Hogwarts, it was a bad position to be in. Bill and Fleur were getting by, but it was difficult. Bill took several days to track down Remus and make sure he was safe, and the two of them started talking about moving into their cabin, which meant they had to endure Muriel's constant sniping about being improper. Charlie was too far out to reply to letters quickly, and Percy was still nowhere to be found. Or rather, he was exactly where he was before, a personal assistant to Thickness and still not acknowledging his family. Even though George and Fred thought he wasn't quite as detached from all of them as they thought, she could tell it stung Arthur and Molly badly. As Percy warned, Arthur was demoted. He wasn't officially bumped down to Obliviator, but his old office, Misuse of Muggle Artifacts, was moved to the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, and his duties were reduced to a glorified Obliviator, since most of the Muggle protection laws were quietly being repealed, which in many ways was an even worse sign. Hermione spent her days surrounded by parchment covered in runes and equations, jumping around from topic to topic whilst trying to solve even one of her problems. She tried to get Bill's help with them, but he was busy, and it was frustrating for her to communicate solely through writing even when he was there. When he was away, she muddled through, getting advice from Fleur and the twins when they could help. Several days later, Bill and Fleur made an announcement at the family dinner. "Bill and I have been talking," Fleur said, "and we have decided to move up the wedding." "Move up the wedding?" Molly said in surprise. "Why, we've already planned." Bill finished the thought for her. "We planned to have it at the Burrow. Even if it were safe to go back and rebuild, that would be a huge complication, and we won't really be able to invite more than close family under the circumstances." "I suppose not," Molly said glumly. "When did you want to move it to?" "The 1st of February," Fleur said. "A week and a half?" she said in surprise. "I didn't know you were practically eloping." "It's not eloping if the family's there, Mum," Bill said, rolling his eyes. "That should give enough time to get Fleur's parents and sister in and out of the country safely." Hermione started writing a note. "And if we must move into Bill's cabin soon, we thought we should be proper," Fleur pointed out. "That's very considerate of you," Arthur said. "I'm sure we can set up something small by then." "It's a better date for a wedding anyway," Muriel interrupted. "Imbolc instead of Lammas. A time for new beginnings." "We don't celebrate either of those, Auntie Muriel," Molly groaned. Hermione tapped her pen on the table to get their attention. "Do we know if Fleur and her family are targets? Do we need to plan an operation to get them in and out?" "By association, certainly," Bill said. "But you-know-who does seem to be keeping up appearances of a properly functioning ministry. We'll want to take some precautions, but if we keep it quiet, I wouldn't expect much trouble." "For getting them in and out of the country, though," Molly said, "it's probably a bad idea to apply for an international portkey at the ministry. They'd have to come on a Muggle boat." "Actually, there's a train now." "No, not the Magical Orient Express, dear. They'll be watching that too." "There's a Magical Orient Express? I was talking about the Channel Tunnel." "What's the Channel Tunnel?" Wizards could really be frustrating in how they didn't keep up with modern technology. It took a few minutes for Hermione to convince Bill and Fleur that the Channel Tunnel was a feasible and preferable way to get Fleur's family in and out of Britain under the Ministry's proverbial radar, if wizards even knew what radar was. But it took her half the evening and a lot of diagrams to field all of Arthur's questions about how the Muggles had built the thing, whilst fending off Muriel's stalwart denials that it was even possible. But at least the matter was settled, and the wedding date was set. Hermione had not been prepared to be the maid of honor. Perhaps it should have been obvious, but she hadn't made the connection until Fleur asked her that she was Fleur's closest female friend who could make it. There was Gabrielle, but she was only 10, and Hermione offered to sneak Harry, Ron, and Ginny out of Hogwarts to join in, but Molly vetoed that idea. They probably wouldn't miss much, though, since Molly also insisted that they have a proper public ceremony once the war was over. Hermione didn't particularly want the job, mainly because she didn't really know what being the maid of honor entailed, and because she wasn't sure a silent maid of honor was such a good idea, but Fleur insisted, and so she was roped into that as well as being the videographer. The videography job was easy, though. She would just set up her omnoculars to record the ceremony and have the Creevy brothers develop the pictures later. It was a job that was practically unknown in the wizarding world, but not a hard one for a simple case. She got the full maid of honor treatment, though, including the dress, makeup, and a hairstyle that would take her ages to undo, even with magic. Charlie was flying in from Romania to be the best man. Hermione mentioned the Channel Tunnel to him in a letter, but he said he had his own way of getting around. She really hoped he didn't mean riding a dragon. Percy didn't come. She knew that hurt Bill, and hurt Molly even more. She had half a mind to go out with the twins and drag him back there, but with the way things were going at the Ministry, that wouldn't be very safe. Remus and Tonks were the only other people to come, and that was only because Remus was their secret keeper. To be brutally honest, the two of them and Hermione were the only ones who were really big enough targets to warrant such secrecy, although a wedding would be a tempting target regardless. They wound up going through a complicated series of flues and apparitions to gather the whole wedding party together in a little clearing outside Hogsmeade. The officiant was the same little old Vicar who had officiated Dumbledore's funeral, so it was good to know he could apparently be trusted. The ceremony was fast, but was standard fare, allowing for the lack of music, and Fleur looked radiant and happy in her dress, so it wasn't the worst wedding she'd ever been to. Although, that wasn't hard. It would be hard to top Uncle Jack's second wedding. The reception dinner was, after much deliberation, held at Pruitt Manor, with the understanding that the Delacours wouldn't reveal anything about the place. It was really just a large family dinner, but it served, and they got to exchange gifts and eat cake and everything. Since Hermione's gift required a bit of explanation, and she couldn't speak, she opened it for the happy couple personally, revealing 2 gold rings, but not for ring fingers. She held up her own hand with her ring on her left forefinger and handed them a note. "My gift to both of you, and I probably should have done this sooner. 2 warning rings with protean charms, same as Arthur, Molly, and the twins have. You will be able to call for help, and I will be able to pass messages to you and others we trust." "Merci beaucoup, Hermione," Fleur replied and embraced her. "Yes, thank you," Bill said. "I'd hardly even thought of that. We have Patronus messages for when we need to talk to someone fast, of course, but I've seen what you did with the rings, and they have some real advantages." Hermione nodded and replied, "A Patronus message is conspicuous. You never know if it will be safe on the receiver's end. The protean charm is much subtler." "That's right," he agreed, "and I probably should have thought of this myself now that we're splitting up." Hermione nodded again. She had made 6 new rings for her little network, to be given to people she personally trusted, outside the normal Order channels. After all, the Order had been betrayed before, and Snape had to report something to you-know-who as it was. She'd originally made them because she hadn't trusted the Order itself, not after Dumbledore had sacrificed Sturgis Podmore to the Dementors to keep his secrets. She had wanted a way to send messages that didn't go through him, but even now that he was gone, it was still good practice. In this case, Bill, Fleur, Ron, Ginny, Neville, and Luna would be added to the 9 she could already send messages to. She'd had to briefly remove the silencing charm from herself to make them, but it was worth it. Unfortunately, sending messages was still one to many and many to one, so it still wasn't the optimal level of secrecy in a resistance movement. She found herself rereading The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and wondering if there was a way to implement Heinlein's tetrahedral cellular resistance structure in the wizarding world. It occurred to her that putting 2 bands of characters on the rings with 2 protean charms would improve them, allowing them to send separate messages to just a few upstream and downstream. But then she would have to remake all the rings, and many more for new recruits. And did it even make sense when the wizarding world was so small that everybody knew everybody else? And then there was the problem of the rings themselves being noticeable if too many people wore them. Heinlein's resistance relied on having no written records, or, failing that, unbreakable encryption. Could she spell them invisible, perhaps? Well, something to think about another time. She had enough on her plate as it was. At least she had a way to contact Bill remotely now, and that was what she most needed. It was a difficult few more days before Hermione finally drew up a method that would solve the problem of the taboo curse. A large part of the problem was that when she realized what it required, she needed to think up all the ways it could be used against her and guard against them. It still wasn't as good as she wanted, but it would work, and she didn't think she would be able to improve it very much. She asked Bill over and showed him her figures, and he agreed. "Well, it'll work," he said. "It'll be dangerous, but it'll work." "I'll need help. We'll have to fight before I'm done." "True," Bill said. "We'll need to ask the others, as many as will come. I don't think getting the numbers we need will be that hard. Most of the Order would do it for Harry, but how many times will we need to do this?" 5 at most. Hopefully not that many." 5 is at least 2 more than I'm comfortable with, though. If you can cut it down." She shrugged. "Come on, let's tell Mum and Dad," he said with a sigh. Hermione and Bill gathered the family, including George and Fred, and the 7 of them sat around Muriel's dining room while Hermione explained what she'd found. "I found a way to get around the taboo curse, to stop myself from saying you-know-who's name. I'll have to find a runestone and do a ritual." "A ritual?" Molly said. "Rituals are dangerous, Hermione." "I know, but I know how they work. You can analyze them with arithmancy, just like all magic. Sometimes it's just a little more difficult. Bill said my numbers work out." Molly gave her eldest son a very sharp look when she read that. "Bill, Hermione says you're behind her on her plan. Is that true?" "Her numbers do work out, Mum," he said carefully. "There's some definite issues, and it won't exactly be safe, but I think it's the least bad option for her if she's really that worried about slipping up and saying the name, and I think Harry will definitely need it." "I see," Molly said. "All right, Hermione. Just how does this ritual of yours work?" "It's based on Professor Snape's Langlock curse. It will stick my tongue to the roof of my mouth any time I try to say the name. It reverses the taboo so that the signal will bounce back to me untraceably and keeps me from speaking instead of tripping it." "But what about the sacrifice?" she asked. "It has one, doesn't it?" "This ritual works by balance. In order to block you-know-who's name, I have to sacrifice another name, one with positive associations. I chose my mother's name. It's not permanent. It will only last until I undo the ritual. It's like a particle-antiparticle never mind. The point is, it doesn't require a traditional sacrifice because it has 2 opposing effects. That's why it took so long to calculate. Anyway, I'll still be able to call her Mum or Mother until then, so it won't do any harm." Hermione didn't mention that the ritual also required 2 drops of blood to attune the runestone to her magic. Not something you wanted to do every other week, but not a serious consideration for a one-off. Molly frowned as she read the note and passed it around. She almost stopped to voice her objection halfway through, but she waited to finish it. The others read it and looked similarly uncomfortable. "That's a pretty drastic step," Arthur said with a frown. "But I suppose you're right, and if it's not permanent, it won't be that bad." "Thank you, Arthur, but there's a catch." "What's that?" "I have to actually speak you-know-who's name to do the ritual." "Oh," he said. Molly gasped, and George and Fred looked very worried. "But that'll bring the Death Eaters down on us again," George pointed out. "Yes, but we'll know they're coming," Bill pointed out, "and from what we've seen, they're going in pairs. We'll need to be ready when the Death Eaters show up, but we can handle them with enough of us." "Say, wouldn't that be a good way to catch Death Eaters?" Fred suggested. "Yeah, set up an ambush and say you know whose name to call them," George added. "I doubt it," Bill said. "I mean, yes, for the ritual we'll pretty much have to, but they'll catch on pretty quick and change tactics. As it is, I'm worried what'll happen if we do it too many times. Hermione, Harry, Sirius, and Remus, and I'm hoping Ginny doesn't need it. We'll need to be ready for them to pull something tricky. That's why we need more people." "Well, I'm sure Sirius and Remus will be on board, maybe others," Arthur said. "I don't think we'll have trouble getting enough people if we need them. I'm more worried if Who figures out you've worked a way around the taboo." "Can he modify it in any way he can use to catch us again?" Bill thought for a minute. "Not really. The spell can't use a word that's too common, or it would be useless, and it would probably draw too much power at that scale. He could set it to his birth name, maybe. Not many of us use that, either." Hermione considered that. It was plausible, but she was skeptical for a different reason. "Does the taboo apply to Muggles, too?" "Yes. You're not thinking of broadcasting it on Muggle radio, are you? That would only get a lot of innocent people killed and risk the statute of secrecy." Hermione shook her head. She had briefly thought of that, but rejected it on the same grounds. "No, but that means Who won't use his birth name for the same reason. Hello, Tom, riddle me this. Too common." I see your point. But if he catches on, he certainly won't let you use the same runestone twice, and he might put something in place to detect that kind of tampering. He'll definitely bring more resources to bear when he figures it out, which, knowing him, could be after the first time. That's why I asked if you could cut it down." Hermione bit her lip and tapped her pen on the table in thought, thinking of any way she could streamline the process. She got an idea. "I'll need to do the ritual twice. Once for me, and once for Sirius and Remus together. I won't be able to do all three of us at once. We can do them back to back if you know 2 runestones we can apparate to. With Harry at Hogwarts, he can wait until summer and it won't look related. Ginny can do it with him if she needs to." "Twice back to back," Bill said. "That I think we can pull off. What do you think, Dad?" It's still dangerous," Arthur said. "It'll be tricky, but I think you're right, Bill. It's the least bad option, and I think we should do it right away as soon as we can round up the people." Molly pressed her lips into a thin line as she surveyed the table. "Well, I don't much like it," she said. "But you've already sacrificed so much, Hermione, going around silenced for nearly a month. The least we can do is help you get around this problem, and it'll be safer that way anyway. So, let's see what we can do." "Thank you, Molly." The Weasleys gathered Remus, Tonks, and Sirius to join the 7 of them for the rituals. They considered waiting for Kingsley and Moody, but they hadn't been reliable to get hold of them lately. Even Molly came to help protect them. Most of her family tried to stop her, but she said if 3 of her sons were going to be out here fighting, then she would be too. And, she reminded them, she had once been a qualified defense tutor. Bill and Fleur escorted the others to and from a remote runestone they knew about via sidelong apparition until all 10 of them were at the site. For her own part, Hermione could do the ritual herself, with the other 9 to defend her from the 2 Death Eaters they expected to show up. The next round, when there would be only 7 defenders, would be harder. Hermione stood over the runestone. Bill had led them to one along a major ley line that ran from Sunderland to Hull. It was larger and older than the one near Hogsmeade, being of Roman origin, a column nearly as tall as she was, inscribed with Latin runes, with Norse additions and modifications made later. It would have been easier if she could carve some new runes into the milestone. She could have done it without the blood that way, but she couldn't leave any identifiable marks. Instead, she pulled a smaller runestone from her robes, one she had carved herself. It was about the size of a CD and just under an inch thick, and she had already attuned it with a drop of blood. She placed it on top of the column. Then, making a pinprick with her black stiletto, she placed a drop of blood on one of the key runes on the milestone and spoke for the first time in days. "Legate scripta." There was a flash of light, and the tiny bloodstain was absorbed into the rock. Currents of power, just barely visible, flowed from her runestone down to multiple points on the milestone, and also around her wrist, linking the 3 together. She spoke again. "Prohibo nomen Emma Granger adversus nomine illicito ed tapu Voldemort." Within seconds there was a dual pop and a flurry of shouts and spellfire, but all fell quiet in seconds. Hermione looked around, not speaking. 2 Death Eaters were unconscious on the ground. Everyone else looked fine. "We've got it covered, Hermione," Bill said. "Just finish the ritual." She nodded and spoke again. "Langlock, pone custodiam ore meo et ostium circumstance libas meus." The current of power connected to her wrist pulsed with light, and she felt a tingle on her tongue, indicating the binding had taken. "Exsolvite," she finished, and the currents released. She turned back to the group. "So did it work?" asked Fred. "I'll try it," she said. "Be ready, Yes, it worked. Phew. Oh, it feels so good to be able to talk freely again. I could sing." "You never really had to silence yourself, Hermione," Arthur said. "I know, call me paranoid, but I didn't want to take the chance," she said. "Well, it's good to finally have you back," George said, and kissed her. "Thanks, George." She looked down at the unconscious wizards. "What about the Death Eaters?" "I vote we kill him," Sirius said. "Padfoot, we're not going to kill 2 stunned prisoners," Remus chastised him. "Why not? We know Azkaban won't hold them." "Because we want to be better than that." "He's right, Sirius," Bill said. "I don't want to cross that line." "I don't know," Tonks cut in. "I don't like it either, but we've got to do something with them. If we just let them go, we'll never win anything." Bill sighed. "Look, if we had someplace set up to hold them, it would be different. But right now we can barely keep ourselves safe. We need to move fast and avoid arousing suspicion. This isn't a capture operation. We can talk about what to do with captured Death Eaters later, but these 2, let's just obliviate them and drop them a couple miles away." "Now wait a minute," Fred cut in. "We can do better than that. Let's tie them up and drop them in the Ministry atrium." George, Hermione, and Arthur laughed a little, but Remus was thoughtful. "You know, that's not such a bad idea," he said. "At least that way the Ministry will have to make a show of sending them to Azkaban, and there are still a few loyal R's who might be able to pull off something better than we can think of under the Death Eaters' noses." "If we hurry, we can tie them and the next pair up and drop them down the visitors' lift," Sirius suggested. "Yeah," Tonks agreed, "and take their wands and strip them to their pants so that everyone can see the dark marks." That was a little more drastic than Hermione was expecting, but most of the group quickly agreed to it. Still, Bill was right. If this was a real war, they would either have to start cursing to kill, or find a reliable way of holding prisoners. Neither particularly appealed to her, and it would be one more problem for her to work on. Great. The second site was far to the south, on a ley line that ran between Portsmouth and Ramsgate. They took the now restrained Death Eaters with them as part of a string of apparitions that left the group tired and needing a breather afterwards. "I really need to learn Sidelong Apparition," Hermione said. "I need to be more than dead weight for something like this. How long does it take to learn it?" "For you, probably an afternoon," said George with a grin. "Normally a few weeks. It's not that hard once you've learnt regular apparition." "Can you help me with it?" "I thought you'd never ask, Hermione. But let's take care of this stuff first." The second ritual went much the same as the first. It required a slightly different runestone, and she had to divide up the lines between herself and Remus and Sirius, but it worked perfectly. The part she was most worried about, the Death Eaters, actually didn't cause much trouble. Fortunately, 2 people saying you-know-whose name in the same time and place still only merited a response of 2 Death Eaters, although they did come out cursing, and the Weasleys had a job of holding them off until the ritual was done. Hermione finished it as fast as she could so the 3 of them could join the fray, and they soon put them down with no serious injuries. "Phew, that was tense," Hermione said. "I see what you meant about not repeating it, Bill. At least we won't have to deal with that again until Harry's back in the summer." "Yep," Sirius agreed. "Now let's get rid of these idiots." Within an hour, 4 half-naked, hog-tied, and obliviated Death Eaters were sent down the visitors' lift to much commotion in the Ministry, and the Weasleys headed back to Muriel's Manor. Hermione, however, went with George and Fred back to the twins' shop for the evening. "So, Hermione," George said, "now that you're free to speak again, do you want to go out for dinner? If we went to a Muggle place, no one would notice you, you know." Hermione smiled at him. Yes, I'd like that, George. Great. We'll just make sure the flat's secure. The twins went to open up the building when suddenly they heard a disembodied voice whispered, "Psst, hey!" Hermione, George, and Fred whirled around, their wands drawn. "Who's there?" she ordered. "Show yourself!" "Oh, thank Merlin," the voice said as an invisibility cloak fell to the ground. "I was afraid I'd missed you. The shop was closed, I didn't know how to get to your Aunt Muriel's, and Sirius is miles out in Muggle London. I thought I'd have to sneak back to the Hogshead and silence myself like you." "Harry," Hermione said as she stared at him, "what are you doing here?" "I kind of got run out of Hogwarts by an angry mob."